Hi, everyone ready for a nice afternoon siesta? Okay. Hello, my name's David. I'm attached to the University of Iceland, as I explained yesterday. I'm a Brit, originally from London. I live in Normandy, so if that's all clear, I will crack on with the first of my slides, which I like to show, which is sort of tangentially related to what I'll be talking about, in the sense that, well, one of the reasons we travel, I think, is because we like to look at different cultures, different attitudes around the world, and this is drawn from the Economist Intelligence Unit. The Democracy Index map, which generally creates a lot of contention, fury, and hopefully interest as well, because like all statistics, it can be picked apart, of course. So it is kind of related to what I'm talking about. We have 4 categories. You can, as I say, pick them apart as you like. Full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid, and authoritarian. And we are traveling, obviously, around the north coast of the European continent, just leaving Belgium, which unfortunately doesn't figure in the first top 30 of these countries because it is technically a flawed democracy, but we can come on to that. But one of the places we've just come from, just before you lovely people joined, was Norway, which constantly comes at the top of the list because they do something very right in Norway. Somehow they seem to get to the top of the list of lots of indices, including happiness indices and other things. GDP, of course, as well. So, anyway, this is just a bit of fun, really, before we start talking about lovely France, where we're heading at the moment, which is number 24 on the list, just shy of being a flawed democracy. But the main thing to bear in mind to some extent is the trending. So this is the trending over the last 8 years, who's heading in the right direction. The UK, slightly above France. Anyway, obviously all of this is open to debate. How do they collate their information, and how do we rate their findings? Bottom of the list here, 167 countries in the world, of course. Bottom of the list, no great surprises. Afghanistan, Syria, Central African Republic, and DRC here. No great shocks in the system, if you like, but these are the authoritarian regimes. Anyway, all of this is available publicly online if you look up the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index. This is a little bit more helpful. These are the 5 criteria that they use. I won't go into them in detail. Electoral process, functioning of government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. And these are the 5 criteria that they use, as I say, Norway. And most of the Scandinavian countries and the Nordic countries, top of the list. We had a lot of Swiss guests on our last cruise. They were very pleased to see themselves there as well. So there we go. And these are the 4 categories: full, flawed, hybrid, and authoritarian. Anyway, that brings us on to the stuff of revolution, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about today. So I mentioned that I live in Normandy. I am now a French citizen, so I am a refugee of Brexit, which means that I can criticize the French with impunity, because I am French, technically, although I still hold my UK passport. And I thought it would be interesting to play with this idea of the other French Revolution, because, of course, we have very romantic notions, of France maybe, but certainly of Paris, and the Rive Gauche, and the River Seine, where we may possibly have walked in the past, and the Sorbonne University, very elegant, beautiful building on the left bank, founded in the 13th century, way back. And you may have noticed Paris in the headlines at the moment. Anybody heading there after the cruise? Well, if you are, good luck. But it's certainly doing itself no disservice by taking millions of selfies of itself while the Olympics are on, doing nothing to dissuade the millions of tourists who go there for the beauty of the place. And, of course, the lovely, relaxed cafe culture that we're all familiar with along the banks of the Seine. But if you'd have come here in 1968, you would have seen something very different. You would have seen cobblestones being thrown by angry students and protesters, millions of workers on strike, and a brutal response from the equally lovely French police. The May 68 uprising that we were talking about. So we have a very different Paris in the offing in May 1968. This is no reflection on anyone's age, but does anybody have any first-hand recollection of this? I'm slightly too young, but... we do? Okay. Interesting. I'd love to hear your input. But we're not that distant from this series of events. Anyway, the air at the time would not have been as sweet as it is today. It would have been thick with tear gas and the heady scent of a repeat, let's say, of maybe the chaotic revolution of the 18th century and beyond that of the 19th. By the 20th century, to some extent, those earlier revolutions had receded into the distant past, and they had been replaced by more recent and vivid memories of the outbreak of the First and Second World Wars, and after that, a bloody and turbulent period of decolonization during which the French spent many years locked in a vicious war in what the French referred to as Indochine, which we probably know better as Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. They were, after World War II, desperately trying to hold on to their colonies in the Far East, and only left after the humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu. They then almost immediately became engaged in a violent war over demands for independence in another colony in Algeria, which sort of kicked off in 1954, but came to a head at the end of that decade, which I'll come to in a moment, and where Diana will be sailing after this cruise. Despite all of this, within what the French refer to as the hexagon, mainland France, the middle classes were actually enjoying something quite unprecedented. A long period of stability and peace and prosperity in the post-war period, not dissimilar to experiences in the US and in the UK. It was known in France as les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, the 3 decades of a sudden explosion in consumerism and affluence, an astonishing rise in living standards, including the appearance of wonderful new labor-saving devices, washing machines, cars, televisions, of course, even paid holidays for the lucky few. Radical new ideas started to also come into fruition, including in France and the UK, public health care, welfare, unemployment benefit. Life after the end of the Second World War became, for many French, suddenly quite comfortable and quite content, which might strike you as hard to believe, as you may think of the French as constantly protesting and complaining. But the truth is, out of nowhere, despite all this newfound comfort, French students suddenly began those angry, violent protests. This is a much more modern photograph of more recent demonstrations, but this moment in May 1968 pretty much kicks off this sudden discontent. In many ways, those social patterns that happened in France end up mirroring what had started to happen also in the US But the timing and the reasons and the background, let's say, were noticeably different. Because back in the mid-60s in mainland France, they didn't really have a reputation for protest. Middle-class French youth were actually too sensible. They were too smart going out, getting degrees, and finding decent jobs to waste time demonstrating or getting into trouble. As was happening, obviously, in the US, in the civil rights movement, and the anti-Vietnam protests. On a cultural level, too, you could say, it would be fair to say, I think, that France was nowhere near as radical or as progressive, maybe, as the US or the UK. And the 60s were in full swing in the UK. Everyone was enjoying a decade of peace and love and also protest, but not, as I say, in France. But let's understand a little bit more about this moment of May 1968. If we go back a decade, as I say, to the middle of the 1950s, we go straight into that French defeat in Indochina, another violent crisis that then started to destabilize this nice new period of post-war comfort and prosperity. And that was, as I said, the war in Algeria. By 1958, Algerian attempts to win independence, remember this entire vast country was a colony of France at the time, started to threaten to topple the very republic itself. The ailing French parliament of what then was called the Fourth Republic. And the politicians on the right, as well as military generals, then did something that managed to finally persuade General de Gaulle back out of retirement and to apply his hand to the situation. And it is de Gaulle who will become one of the key players in what happened in '68, a decade later. So de Gaulle was known, obviously, for having something of a paternalistic style, let's say. It had served him well during the war. He had kept alive this sort of mystified, romantic idea of France, maybe personified a little bit by our ideas of Paris, as I showed at the start. And it was enshrined to some extent in a famous quote of his where he talks about having a certain idea of France inspired both by feelings as well as reason. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But this certain idea of France transcends just daily life. It was an idea of France's current president, who is clearly not enjoying a moment of glory, but it is an idea that seems to transcend those daily troubles of politics. For de Gaulle, this daily political infighting is just exasperating. He famously was the man who said, how can you govern a country with 258 kinds of cheese? So he was an authoritarian, he was patriarchal, let's say, he was paternalistic, but he wasn't too big on compromise and democratic consensus. He was a man who came from a very pretty village up in the northeastern region. Colombe les Deux Églises, you can still visit it. It's a very lovely part of the world. It is clearly very removed from the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day that he then gets involved in. And what he gets involved in, as I say, is this very dirty war in Algeria. The independence movement that was pushing to leave France was opposed by a group of people known as les Pieds Noirs, which you might think is a racial slur, the black feet. This actually applied, ironically, bizarrely, to the mostly white European population, of which there was about 1 million in the late 50s living in Algeria. The etymology or the origin of the phrase supposedly comes from men who hauled coal or who manipulated the coal steamers that operated around the north of the Med. It's not too clear where the phrase comes from. It's still used perfectly normally in France and apparently not pejoratively. So the Pieds Noirs were the white community living in Algeria at the time. And they were insisting that this vast landmass should remain part of France. They clearly had a big investment in doing so. To them, decolonization, which was happening all around, certainly in the UK as well, in terms of the empire being dismantled. We look at the fact that India became independent in 1947, and this is just after the Suez Crisis in 1956. So decolonization is a very big and obviously contentious issue, but Algeria starts to become a focal point for the French. De Gaulle initially assures those Pieds Noirs that he will resist the independence demands and that he will look after them. But over time, and not very long, he gradually comes to understand that as a pragmatist, in fact, independence was inevitable, given what else was going on geopolitically around the world. And he then proposes a vote on Algerian self-determination, and the Pieds Noirs smell betrayal. They form the OAS, a paramilitary unit, because they lose confidence in the French authorities to support them. De Gaulle, in the end, clearly, with hindsight, is proved right. Decolonization happens around the world. The two old empires in particular, the British and the French, will no longer even be able to afford to keep their colonies, and Algeria would eventually gain its independence in 1962, but not before a very bloody war and something very odd in April 1961, which was an attempted coup in France by 4 generals to actually take over the Assemblée Nationale, the French parliament, which was defeated. So you can see there are these cracks forming in what is now the Fifth Republic. And in de Gaulle's presidency, those cracks were really starting to show. So that pretty River Seine, that is today the scene of those picture postcard Olympics that we're witnessing, becomes the epicenter of what were in the early 60s, these shockwaves happening through France. And not least because what is here a photo of the modern day equivalent of the CRS, who are the French security service, were not, let's say, much loved. They were particularly implicated in 1961 in forcing 200 protesting Algerians into that pretty River Seine, where they would drown. And that was an atrocity that France has only actually recently apologized for and publicly been allowed to discuss, if you like, in schools and universities. It had been more or less covered up until quite recently. So these million Pieds Noirs, who now find themselves no longer welcome in the colonies, start to arrive in the mother country, and they go through something of a transformation, as many decolonized people did. They were welcomed to some extent in France, but on the other hand, there were a lot of them, and integration starts to become a bit of an issue. They're not necessarily all ethnically French. Many were Spanish, many were Italians, many were from the south of France, and many of them are then rehomed in parts of northern France where they don't necessarily find a warm welcome. But France at this point is largely still an agricultural economy, and it really isn't until the Second World War, and largely thanks to the Marshall Plan, that they start to see that phenomenal GDP growth that I mentioned. And we're talking about 5 to 6% a year. And that in turn was fueling this massive rise in post-war investment and in industrialization, and that would become the consumer society that I've also made reference to, including a mass social housing program on the outskirts of many cities, including Paris, of course, in what became known as les banlieues, the suburbs. And these were blocks that were put up in the 50s, in the time of modernism, when many of them were built rapidly. Many of them were not built particularly well, but the intention, let's say, might have been a good one. They haven't aged well. Their brutalist designs are today considered pretty ugly. They may have been a brave new world then, but they certainly are not today. They've become low-cost housing programs with a lot of social issues, and they are a far cry, of course, from those beautiful Haussmann boulevards of central Paris. One reason, really, why central Paris looks as wonderful as it is because over the decades, the city effectively created these very separate communities, which were often physically separated from the center of Paris by massive new ring roads that they then built over the 60s when we were all in love with the automobile. And they were known as the peripheriques. If you've ever been foolish enough to drive around Paris, you will no doubt have got stuck on the peripherique, and they're ghastly things. But anyway, they do physically separate in many ways the beauty of central Paris from these not at all beautiful banlieues, the suburbs. So all of this to say that this new opportunity generated a rush to the cities. Many of those pieds noirs came in to find jobs, often involved in construction on some of these programs of building these tower blocks and big road projects. And all of this was compounded with the influx of immigrants from lots of other parts of the colonies that were slowly closing down. And on top of that, post-war French couples had been busy. They had been having babies during the Trente Glorieuses, and that had generated a baby boom, as we're familiar with in our own countries, that to some extent actually eclipsed those of Britain and the UK. And all that to say that by 1968, the year we're interested in, the number of young students in French universities had literally exploded. So in the same spirit of that mass housing program and that road building program, the French government then built a massive university program. Also, of course, in that 50s, 60s modernist style, also in many cases not well built either. The idea, as I say, might have been well-intentioned, but they were often thrown up quickly. There was often local corruption, and they were on the edge of those cities too. They also hastily recruited many of their teaching staff, and many of those teaching staff were less than competent, let's say. But there were now so many students in these huge campuses and overspill lecture theatres because of a lack of space that they were actually listening to lectures on loudspeakers, in some cases outside the buildings. And they rarely, if ever, got to meet their lecturers. So one of these vast campuses was known as Nanterre. I don't know if you've ever been to this part of Paris, but it's notorious for a lot of reasons. It was built as a model for the future. This was a brave new world of publicly accessible education. But as I say, by the 60s, Nanterre was not looking that pretty. It was still a massive building site. It was a desolate place. It was 7 miles out of the city, and it was really almost impossible to get to. The transport links were terrible. It was a far cry from that majestic Sorbonne. So Nanterre's 12,000 students start to become increasingly miserable, dissatisfied with their poor conditions, and they increasingly associate their conditions with what they come to see as, let's call it an arrogant, out-of-touch establishment. And that dissatisfaction is personified in an article in Le Monde where they talk about when France is bored. And it's an interesting way to discuss what happened, because in a way, the boredom, if you like, or the restlessness of the fruits of these 30 glorious years starts to be enshrined in the protest movement that occurs at that time. The establishment that they are pushing against was personified by de Gaulle. And he is not initially worried. He sees what's going on in other countries as mostly something to be ignored or dismissed. They wouldn't clearly spread to France. You could say it was this comfortable attitude that enraged the student movement. It was this sense of overconfidence, let's say, that turned into unrest and that discontent. And it initially led to low-level student protests, led by this guy, Danny Le Rouge, Danny the Red, who happened to be red-headed as well as being a left-winger. He wasn't a communist, interestingly. In fact, the communists, or the French Communist Party, saw the students as more or less irrelevant bourgeois intellectuals who they didn't need to bother with. Upset about badly built lecture halls didn't concern the Communist Party. Despite that, Danny Le Rouge is known as Danny the Red. He is, interestingly, still a member of the European Parliament. He was the son of two German Jews who escaped the Nazis and made their lives in France. So he became the leader, the erstwhile leader of this movement, and they become known as les enragés, the angry ones of May 68. And initially, as I say, the university and the administration are not at all fazed, but they're also unused to this kind of protest. As I said, it's not common in the 60s to have found this kind of discontent. And slowly they start to wonder whether they should impose some kind of sanction on all of this disruption. So what they do is they expel the main ringleaders from university. That is, if you like, the touchstone that lights the fuse that ends up triggering more protest. And throughout April 1968, the protest leads to other campuses, and in response to that, in May, the rector then inflames the situation further. He decides to close the entire Nanterre campus. That is not a strategic move, because what do the increasingly enraged students do as they move into their vacations and into the summer? They move 7 miles down the road into the heart of Paris, led by Danny Le Rouge. With hindsight, it might be fair to say that the escalation of May 68 probably wasn't really due to the closing of Nanterre. It was probably due to what happens next, because the reaction of that infamous CRS is what then triggers a massive explosion of discontent. The cries on the street are now CRS SS, nothing like inflaming a situation, and the student union now calls for more marches, which just happen to coincide with the peace talks that are going on in Paris at the time to try to resolve the Vietnam War. So, an infuriated President de Gaulle decides to take matters into his own hands, and he bans the student march for security reasons linked to the peace talks. So his authoritarian, no-compromise approach then raises tensions even further, and the whole thing gets pretty nasty. By now, de Gaulle is in his late 70s. He's increasingly little patience for what he sees as the depravity of the swinging 60s, and he really does have a headache about these long-haired layabouts and dropouts and hippies and losers that he detests in the Anglo-Saxon countries of the UK and America, and he is absolutely adamant will not have their day in France. Remember, of course, that he believed in this certaine idée de la France. He is not about to capitulate to those hippies. So on the 7th of May, the students start doing what they do best. They get even more upset, and they build barricades to stop the police removing them. And that leads to the first night of the barricades. It's something that's become enshrined in a sort of romantic mysticism in some student circles today even, but it's the first episode of real violence on the streets. The students start picking up the famous Parisian cobblestones and they throw them at police. Paris has not seen trouble like this since, you could really say, the Paris Commune of 1871. Things get very ugly very fast. And it's possibly the shadow of those communes that hung over the whole story of May 68. As I say, maybe even, and I know it's a stretch, but maybe even a romantic vision of the past. In fact, both sides, in a way, were role-playing a sort of romantic vision. De Gaulle had this romantic vision of a certaine idée de France, and the students had their own slightly romantic or romanticized or fantasized vision, even down to graffiti honoring the Commune. Anyway, by now all of this has led to more students marching, no longer protesting about lousy buildings on campus. Their demands had become much more entrenched, and they were increasingly embittered, and the demonstrations start to spread across the whole country outside Paris. They were particularly incensed by some of this old guard that they see de Gaulle representing, and in some cases even supporting. And this man in particular, Maurice Papon, who becomes one of the figureheads of their discontent, was the head of the CRS. He had ordered them to attack those Algerians on the Pont Saint-Michel in 1961, but Papon is now exposed as a Nazi collaborator. And that combination of news utterly inflames the situation. To de Gaulle, this is all just tittle-tattle, it's nonsense. He needs to crack down on the students, but Papon becomes a real point of hatred. De Gaulle's rhetoric doesn't calm anyone. He talks to them in what they see as a patronizing way, and his lack of admonishment of Papon doesn't help at all. So the demonstrations erupt again, and on the 10th of May, there's another night of the barricades, and all of this is aired for the first time on French TV, much like was happening in the US for the Vietnam protests. Traditional France is shocked. Others are eager for change, and they are shocked by the police reaction. And the occupation spread, and it is not helped by Georges Pompidou, who is de Gaulle's prime minister at the time, who will later become president in the 70s, who famously reinforces a line that de Gaulle had said earlier, but had been more or less ignored. But when Pompidou repeats it, it becomes another focal point of distrust and discord. The real word, chien-lit, is nothing to do with dogs. You can probably guess, if you know any French at all, what that means. But reform, yes. Chaos, no. And that now becomes another refrain that the students pick up and use to get mad about. The police at this point have largely withdrawn from large parts of central Paris. So the left bank is a no-go zone, and at this point, thanks to the TV coverage, much of the French working class get involved, and it's coming up to the summer, everyone's getting literally heated, and everybody goes on strike. Many of the workers that now get involved with the student protest had been building much of that road system, many of those banlieues, but they had not seen much of the fruits of that consumer miracle that I mentioned earlier. And they had come, many of them, from those either rural communities into the urban cities now that had begun to expand, and many of them also came from Algeria, from the community of the Pieds Noirs, and were not feeling particularly integrated. So those bleak new banlieues had started to become a new flashpoint of contention. So what happens now is that a huge strike takes place at an aircraft manufacturer in Nantes. The workers go on strike for better conditions, and they end up locking the management in their offices. And all this is really unknown in France until this point. The strikes spread to a Renault plant in Billancourt near Paris, and by the 18th of May, 2 million workers are on strike. By the 23rd of May, 10 million workers are on strike. 2/3 of the French workforce. This is colossal. And increasingly their demands were less about conditions and more about pushing back against what they saw as the entire top-down state. And it really starts to smell like revolution. De Gaulle is clearly very distressed, as you can imagine. The two groups of protesters, though, these middle-class French students and the factory workers, rarely aligned much in their views or in their demands. Daniel Lerouge, many years later, would say they never really were a joint force, but actually at the time, they looked like they were. Many of the students looked to the workers like frivolous middle-class philosophers. They came out with lots of philosophical phrases, which you can still buy on T-shirts in Paris, but they weren't really asking for the same concrete demands as the workers, so they didn't really create a binding force. But de Gaulle, in his late 70s, is losing grip of the situation. The 68ers, as they became known, the 68ers, are now focused on one thing: getting rid of de Gaulle. Adieu de Gaulle. And 10 ans, ça suffit. 10 years is enough. So tensions are high, as I say, the protests and the strikes continue, and de Gaulle now does something very, very out of character. He is, remember, he is this solid wartime hero. He's known for his decisiveness. He's this patriarch. He has always been a man you could rely on, whether or not you enjoyed his politics. But there is a palpable sense at this point that nobody knows a way out of the mess, including de Gaulle. On the 29th of May, he effectively, well, to the outside world and to his circle, it looks like he panics. In the Élysée Palace, he declares that he's going to go to spend the night at Colombey, his country house. So he tells his immediate advisors that he needs a helicopter and he just needs to go and think back home, away from all of the stress. It turns out he has no intention of going to Colombey. What he does is he takes off in a helicopter with his wife, and he goes east towards Colombey. But it turns out that what he does is he tells his pilot, unknown to anybody else, to keep going and to head for Baden-Baden, right over here in France's military-occupied zone of Germany. And there he finds his old buddy from the Algerian War, General Massu. And as it turns out, now that we know the journal and the diaries and the information that wasn't available at the time, he does a deal with Massu, asking him to back him if he needs military support to crush the student revolt. Back in Paris, this is playing out incredibly badly. It seems that the president has simply lost the plot, that he has fled. And this has echoes back then of Louis XVI fleeing to Varennes during the French Revolution. And what happened then is the revolutionaries caught up with him and chopped his head off. So it's clearly mirroring something pretty distressing to the French consciousness. They have lost their president for several days. As it turns out, de Gaulle may have been much shrewder than anybody imagined. Because what happened was when he came back from seeing his old buddy Massu and getting this reassurance that if he needed military support, literally to crush the students on the streets of Paris, he would have it. He is suddenly re-energized, he's revitalized, and what he decides to do is to give them an ultimatum. He tells the French students and the workers to go back to work, and he gives them a date. And he does it not by broadcasting from London, but by broadcasting by radio, echoing, again, this romanticized idea of the past, because he does it on the radio and not on TV. And it conjures up all of that wartime sense of support, if you like, for the nation. He addresses the nation at 4:30 p.m. and he chooses, as I say, not to speak on TV, but he has really given a date at this point. And he marks his authority at that moment by dissolving Parliament. And for the protesters, it is a clear threat, if you like, but it is a clear make or break moment. And as I said, it turns out to be a brilliant political and strategic move on de Gaulle's part. During this pause, when both sides are utterly confused and utterly unsure what's going to happen next, and when the entire constitution is hanging on the edge of a cliff, and there's a possibility of a military intervention on the streets of Paris, both sides stare each other out. And what happens in the meantime is that 800,000 Gaullists take to the streets. It is the single biggest demonstration in Parisian history. It is a massive vote of support for de Gaulle. The hard-man president that they'd heard on the radio had given them their cue, and they go and they take back control of their city. It is another rerun of a romantic fantasy, you could say, of de Gaulle walking down the Champs-Élysées after the liberation of Paris. So there's so many moments that are mirroring what happened in the past. So you could say that in many ways, the sides are all playing their parts in dramas and histories and in romantic imaginations. Not much of it was that romantic at the time, but we can see how many of these echoes are playing out. It is a huge shock for the student radicals, as you can imagine. Suddenly they are confronted by all of these Gaullists waving French flags, cheering their president, and the nascent revolutionary bubble simply evaporates almost overnight. There is a final flurry from the students at the Odeon Theatre, but by the 13th of June, the whole thing is over. The Sorbonne is cleared, the barricades are gone, and in the general election of next year, de Gaulle nails the biggest legislative landslide in French history. He wins 353 seats, something, as I say, that the current president could hardly imagine. We'll come on to him maybe in another talk. De Gaulle has done his bit. He steps down a year later, and he is replaced or succeeded by Pompidou, who then gives his name to the centre that you're probably familiar with in the middle of Paris, the Pompidou Centre. So, les événements, as they are known in France, the events of May '68, now become part of the history books. And in the end, whatever side you're on, and I'm clearly, well, hopefully, not taking political sides in my talk, '68 was a very strange year in France. was this massive year of protest, of almost revolutions, and yet the ultimate winners politically was an authoritarian traditionalist leader of World War II, and his equally conservative prime minister who takes after him. In some ways, there were echoes in Britain too. After the swinging 60s, the decade of peace and love and hippies and all the rest, the public maybe got tired of it, maybe they just needed a change, but they also voted for calm and stability in the form of Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath. And in the US, maybe you also got bored of the hippies and all of those lefty liberals because perhaps you also got tired of all of the peaceful rhetoric and you voted in Mr. Richard Nixon. So what could possibly go wrong? Anyway, that's my slightly shortened version of the May 68 alternative French Revolution. I'm going to be talking about other things about France, hopefully during the course of our trip, and as we go into Portugal, other moments of geopolitical history. But they're not particularly destination-focused, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of background on the regions that we're traveling to. And I'm not really trying to do a monologue, even though it sounded like one. So if you've got any thoughts and input, and certainly if you were witness to 68, please chime in. But that's my little talk for now. Thank you. Any comments? Any criticism?
I just want to say that I really enjoyed it. I was a student in France in '71, and I sort of knew what was going on, but I never fully put it together. I mean, I was hanging with students. It's excellent.
Great, thank you. Well, you were in Paris in '71. You,